idea that, you know, you can be a person of color and make, right, prejudicial comments about another ethnic, racial group that's not white, right? And of course that can be the case. But the question is, who has the power to make their prejudice relevant? Right? I can be prejudiced all I want individually, right? But do I have the power to enact policies through which my prejudice will now produce disadvantages for this group that I want to be prejudiced toward? It's not the same, right? It's not the same. There's also this displacement currently that's happening to always looking at international locations and saying how bad they have it, and therefore minimizing what the inequalities are in the United States, right? This is another escape valve. This is probably the most common to you, paternalism and tokenism, right? I call it liberal paternalism because it's mostly white liberals who do this the most, right? I've heard 1,000 times my students of color come to me and say how they were asked to speak on behalf of their race in an all-white classroom where they're the only or one of two students of color, right? A form of kind of paternalism of, we want to hear your perspective. What is it like? Without ever interrogating here, who's doing the speaking, who created the discipline that you're studying in, right? And so on and so forth. Okay, I'm going to move through these, right? Because they're familiar to you, right? And I want to talk about guilt. Probably the #1 reasons why. Because somebody, we had the student committee forward us some questions that students wanted to ask, right? And one of the questions was, why don't white people come into student of color spaces, right? Why are they not present in these diversity kind of settings, the places that are supposed to build towards equity? And why are they not, if racism is primarily a problem that white people deal out, right? Why is it always the people who are at the end of that dealing out, right, working towards it? And of course, some of that we can expect because we expect the people in power and privilege not to be the first ones being like, yes, I want to let this go, right? So that's understandable, but the question is, why doesn't even the interaction generally happen, right? And my claim to that is that white folks can be guilty without knowing why, okay? And the way this usually plays out is, a white person saying, I'm not racist before they've even been accused. Why do you have to say I'm not racist if nobody has accused you of racism yet, right? And then there's this question of the accusatory faces. It can be a kind of nonverbal cue, right? People looking at you weird and being like, why are you accusing me? I don't know. And this goes back to the question of ignorance. If you don't know the history of white advantage and privilege and how it got built up historically, right? You might not understand why a person of color is actually looking at you like, hey, why don't you acknowledge your privilege? Because this person's sitting there thinking, I don't have any, right? You see the problem of communication there. And then there's the kind of guilt due to the conscious knowledge of history of white advantage and privilege obtained through violence, practice, and policy, right? For my students who are white who take our classes, right, at some point they're going to go through this, the white students, right? They're going to go through a serious kind of form of shame, right? To kind of to have a history that tells them you have been the oppressor and now you get to get all of these material wealth, all kinds of advantages, right? Opportunities that were won through a process of injustice and discrimination, right? I had this one white conservative Republican kid in my class, and he said, you want me to identify with the original sin of this country? Who wants to do that? And I said, good point. That's a really good question, right? Why would somebody want to identify as calling themselves the oppressor? Or at the very least, having received the benefits of your ancestors, right? Even if they're not directly your ancestors. So what happens if we actually confront history, right? What would happen if white folks actually confronted this history? And instead of using the myths and ideologies to cover up under the notion of hard work, meritocracy, right? That everything is fine now because we have a black president, that I'm not personally responsible for racism because I didn't own any slaves, right? That things are better here and so on and so forth. What would happen? I would say that if that confrontation happens, and if you ever produce that confrontation with a white person, right, either on an interpersonal level or in a classroom setting, whatever, the white person has essentially faces a crossroads, right? And the crossroads is to either kind of deny the testimony of people of color, to deny the stories, to deny the evidence that constantly shows you, right, you do have privilege in X, Y, and Z ways, you do have an advantage, right? The question is, what are you going to do with it, right? So one way to go in the crossroads is to just resist the confrontation, right? If you ever wonder what white people are avoiding all the time in fearing interaction with people of color, I would say that it's this confrontation. And it's a confrontation with themselves, really. It's a confrontation with their own identities, with our own identities, because in my own journey with this, right, it produced essentially what it caused me to, what caused, the crisis it caused in myself was to disrupt the entire worldview that I had been raised with, right? Everything I had kind of assumed about how the world worked proved to be false. It proved to be a lie. Right? So now the question was, who am I? If everything I've ever built myself, my identity on, has been a lie, and here's the truth is there's this huge, long history of privilege and advantage that was purposefully won at the expense of people of color. Who am I? Who can I be now? Right? And so I would say that the receptivity to that confrontation produces an identity crisis, right? To quote James Baldwin, people find it very difficult to act on what they know, because to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. And in this case, the danger in the minds of most Americans is the loss of their identity. If white people really confronted their privileges and advantages, what they would come up against is a moral question. Do I keep this advantage and support a system that perpetuates injustice for the sake of keeping my benefits, my material wealth, my educational opportunities, the educational opportunities of my kids, and so on? Or do I go and fight on behalf of a greater, more collective justice, right? The identity crisis, I won't go into kind of the details of it, we can talk about it more, but the key question, right, is kind of a reconstruction of identity now under anti-racist practice, right? To become anti-racist, right, and this is not just for white folks, right? This is for anyone who wants to fight against these injustices. The idea is that you would have to be committed, not because I'm trying to help those poor people that have nothing to do with me, which is the kind of charity, kind of paternalistic model, right? But because you see yourself implicated and complicit in an unjust system. That's what it would mean to act on principle, right? That you actually don't want to support injustice, not just because it's producing these disadvantages to other people, if you understand it to be linked to your own advantage, right? You have to then decide, I call it choosing to save one's soul over the economic and social advantages, right? To truly create democracy in this country, you would have to actually take from what white people have hoarded for themselves and redistribute it, right? To actually produce a more equitable political and economic structure, right? Now that's the grand view, but the question is, how do we do that in every institution, in every site, chip away little by little? And so, as, of course, people of color have always been at the forefront of calling for justice, right? They have always had to face the predominantly white institution and their resistance to give up some of these advantages and privileges that for most of US history they've hoarded for themselves, right? I call it reframing your notion of value to value people over property. Of course, in a capitalist system like we live in, this is very hard to achieve, right? But it's the longer term vision for me is this idea of valuing communal well-being more than the advantages and opportunities predicated on injustice towards people of color, right? The idea for me also is that over time, racial capitalism is destroying everyone, right? So even those who think that they are protected by their privileges and advantages, at some point, right, will have to face the question of the way in which the collective degradation of our society is taking place, whether that's environmental degradation, spiritual degradation, social alienation, destruction, health effects, right? The whole society is suffering as a result of these inequalities, and even the most privileged and advantaged, right, will not be able at some point, maybe not in the immediate present, right, but in the long-term future, right, they will have to face this question of what are the collective consequences of this kind of radical inequality through which we're living. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and then I guess Dr. Bradwell and I